All right. Well, hey, welcome to our Kairos Network and Planting the Gospel joint webinar. My name is Matt Peoples, and I'm just really stoked. I've been stoked for weeks about this conversation because one, just to have all three of these guys in a room together is like a dream come true. So if nobody else gets anything out of it, I'm going to enjoy it. But I think you're going to get a ton out of it because what each of these guys have in common, even though when you look at their ministry context and they're radically different, is each one of these guys did a complete 180 on their ministry plan based on a desire to do discipleship and seeing what was connecting. And it just radically changed their view of church. So what I want to do really quick is I want to introduce each one of these guys. We've got David Putman. David is the founder of Planting the Gospel. I think David has forgotten more about church planting than I will ever know. He's been everything from church planter to district missional catalyst for the Southern Baptist Church to helping launch churchplanters.com and like everything in between, and is an Auxano Navigator and helps people with vision process stuff. So I'm pumped to learn from him. Trey is on this call. Trey started out as our worship leader at our church plant and then caught the bug, became a church planter, went to seminary, ended up in Houston, all the tools in the world to do a large launch, and has decided to go another direction. So excited to connect with him on that. And then Dan, you maybe saw from some of the promo stuff, Dan actually showed up to our first church plant training session here in New Jersey and said, "Hey, I'd love to plant a church." And I said, "Hey, you speak Spanish. How about bilingual?" He said, "Never." And a year later, he's leading a thriving bilingual ministry. So this is going to be an exciting webinar. So if you have questions, I want you to throw them in the chat. You can also throw them in the Q&A. And anytime we talk about links and stuff like that, we'll dump them in the chat as well. And then we'll also do a follow-up resource to this. And if you find it helpful for yourself or for somebody else, we'll have the full replay here so you can share that out with other people. So for right now, I want to jump into this. And guys, I just want to throw a simple question out to you. What was your picture of church before it changed because of your discipleship picture?
All right, so nobody's going to jump in. Everybody's got what? I'll go ahead and jump in. So, you know, like Matt said, I was the worship leader at a church plant that he started up in Knoxville, Tennessee, and you know, for me, church was well, for us, we were connecting disconnected people. That's what it always has been for me. But it was time and a place that we met. Kind of, you know, what we were doing was attractional ministry, and it was working for the context and the time. We were, meeting in a movie theater in a mall, and we had a killer band, and we were in, the average first time person coming out was 10 to 20 years out of church if they'd ever been at all, and it was awesome. I loved it so much that I had to leave to make more places like it, and so that's kind of what I came to Houston to do. Is I was like, I'm just going to make another place like the Point. And so, I mean, for all the years I was in seminary, I was writing ideas down, and I've got volumes. You can put books together of all the ideas and things that I had. And then when it came down to it, and making disciples became the main thing, all that stuff went out the window. So.
Yeah. Hey, Trey, I appreciate you being the sacrificial lamb there.
And I'm not saying any of that stuff is wrong.
Going first. And now I'll courageously jump into this conversation. Hey, first of all, I see people are putting up where they're from. I'm in the Atlanta area. So Phil, I see you are there. Any of you guys in the Atlanta area, reach out to me. I'd love to connect with you sometime. But Matt, I have to go way back to sort of my church planting story. I planted my first church in 1988. And I think for me, I've always been a bit of a problem solver, sort of approached it from I think what is really an apostolic perspective. Maybe entrepreneurial would be the business term for it. So I'm always looking at the problem to solve. And when I went into church planting, I felt called in seminary, 1985 through 88, out in Kansas City, Missouri. And it was definitely a call to address an issue. And the issue was that our cities were beginning to boom and churches were, they just weren't reaching people. I mean, contextually, there just wasn't a fit. The world was becoming more and more unchurched every moment. And then I began to reach out to people in leadership about planting a church, and they began to almost have this courtship, thing going on. And I would go around and visit different church plant possibilities, and they all were small groups of people who were moving out or maybe just driving out in the suburbs a little bit further and trying to plant what they were just coming out of. So I don't want to be critical, but it seemed like it was a little bit dysfunctional. It wasn't exactly what I wanted. So I was looking for a solution. At the same time, you have people like Warren coming along, who planted his church a few years earlier. And we were just really beginning to hear about a different way of planting, So my point is, for me, it was really the way I saw church it was this big growing organization, frankly. We call them mega churches today. That's what I saw when I thought about church planting. And I even wrote, let me just share this. I'm not selling this. I don't even think it's in printing. That's how long I've been around. But it was a book by Charles Chaney, one of my mentors, a man who has since gone to be with the Lord. I love him. I went to work for him for a season of my life, but he was writing the revised and expanded version of church planting at the end of the 20th century. Great missiologist. I mean, if you want to read missiology about church planting, here's a good place to begin. And so I asked him, I said, Dr. Chaney, why don't you write a book on, the transition that we're seeing in church planting, or at least write something on it in your book you're revising right now? And he says, well, why don't you write it? He was that kind of man, and that was my beginning into writing some things. But I wrote a chapter on how to get off to a big start, and this was like in 89, 90, I think it was finally published in 91. And I'll cut this short because I've gone so long. But, that was sort of my perspective. Went out and planted large churches. Two of the churches I planted became large mega churches, so now I'm doing micro churches, so need I say I've had this pretty incredible, and I'm more fired up than ever about what God is doing. This is the time to be on planet Earth if you're interested in the kingdom. I really believe. So it's good to be here. And that's a little bit of my story.
I love it. Dan, what was your picture?
Yeah. So thanks. Just to follow with Trey and David said, right? My picture was, here we are. We open the doors on Sunday morning and you come in.
Yeah.
And so it's attractional. It was, we're set here, and which is, like Trey says, nothing wrong with that. But soon realized that it wasn't happening, right? That for us, I mean, we did good things at my home church, but for us, it was like, well, you open the doors on a Sunday morning, but people are not coming.
Yeah.
That kind of stirred up something in there to say, there's something got to change and we need to adapt. And so, yeah, it was just that, here we are, you come in, and that kind of changed to what Matt said at the beginning, right? Where we go to where people are, rather than asking them to come to us.
Yeah, and Dan, I'm just gonna say, Dan, I'm glad you boiled it down to that, because that was my picture of planting, was open the doors. And I think we thought it was radically different if the worship style was different or the location was a little bit different. But even that fundamental operating system of open the doors and they will come, was still the same thing, whether it was super liturgical or whether it was super contemporary or, anything you want to do in between. It was that same philosophy. And I think the reason we start with this question and I picked this up when I was doing city to city training. When we first came out here in the city, I took 2 years to go through their church planting cohort because I wanted to learn about planting near a mega city and planting in the Northeast, right? And they said, when it comes to worship, but really I think when it comes to church planting, the biggest obstacle that any planter has is their current picture of what the church should be. And I think every generation, that's always the obstacle, is what is your picture of what the quote unquote form of the church should be? Because while that picture was perfectly painted for another time, it might not be perfectly painted for the time in which you're going into.
Yeah, well, along those lines, what we had what we always think of as church is that come to us, we're going to build it here and come to us.
Yeah.
And what I realized is that, at best right now, I think I'm being really generous with this number, 40% of our culture in America even thinks that format is relevant to their lives. Like how many people do you know have you invited to church over and over and over, and they're never ever going to darken the door of the church? They're never going to come there. And so if what we're doing only really connects with 40% of the people, and I think it's way less than that, but what about the other 60%? If we don't do something to go to them, something that they can connect with, then basically what we're saying is you can literally go to hell. I mean, that's really, I know it's harsh, but that's really that's kind of where things turn for me when I realized that's really what we're saying is you can go to hell unless you do it the way we want you to do it.
Yeah.
That would be a great t-shirt, by the way. I think we should.
Matt, that would look good on you. The way I'll state it oftentimes, and I think this is right, it sort of captures the heart of where you're going there, is the reason I think the church is not growing and the reason we've got to relook everything is that we've reached everyone like us or who wants to be like us. So if they really want to be with us, they found us a long time ago. So we're, it's just fundamentally, we're in a different place today than we've ever been. And
yeah. And I think too, and here's what I want us to recognize, because I think sometimes too, we jump on a webinar like this and it just kind of sounds like down with the existing church. None of us think that. No. A lot of us still work with, and partner with those churches. But I think what we are saying is, there were some definite shifts that took place. And I want you to see that, because that's why we started with, what was your picture of church? Because that picture is what you live for, you gave your life for, you pushed into. And so now there's a shift, but what I have really come to love and respect about each one of these guys on this screen is I got a chance to watch that shift almost as it happened. And so I know there's a shift. And that shift really boils down to discipleship. So could you guys each talk about how you came to a love and a belief in discipleship as the core, and what your big influences were, and then how that began to shift your understanding and your picture of what the church looks like?
I'll start this time. So just to go what Tom in the chat said, Jesus went to people, and that's for us. It's part of our DNA, part of our mission, right? Jesus left heaven, came to earth, and so we leave our places of comfort and we go to the community. And so once we started doing that, then we realized that we're pretty much reaching out to people who didn't have a connection with God. And so we needed to start from the ground up, from the foundation. And so we started doing discipleship, and we started telling people about the basics of the faith and how to be a follower of Jesus. I think that was and that's part of our mission statement, which a lot of churches have that, which is make disciples that in turn will make other disciples. But then once we started getting into that, we realized it's a lot of work, and it looks nice on paper, but it's a lot of work. And I just want to point out what one of my mentors said, and John Trinkline, and he said, discipleship is a lot like parenting. A lot of us don't want to do it. I mean, who wants to be a parent, right? And if you're not a parent, you just remember your younger years, how much hard time you get to your parents. And I look at my family like, wow, I have 3 kids and everybody's different. And that's the way I'm looking at discipleship, where it's like one-on-one, and it's focused on a family and walking along with them in this path of getting to know Jesus, being a follower of Jesus. And that also shifts what we think about the church, which is not an organization, but people walking, the church is just people walking along their path and just being the church.
That was huge.
Yeah, I think, Matt, just going along with Dan here, part of the challenge is that, we live really complex lives. We've developed complex churches. And one of the things the Lord really impressed on me in this whole journey is that, it has to be simple enough to reproduce. It has to be simple enough to do. And so, we began with the irreducible minimal. What do we have to do? What do we have to do to make a disciple? And that's where we started. And that radically changed, in the last couple of years. It started with COVID for me, answering your question, was I had a pastor reach out to me after I did a webinar, and we Zoomed, and he asked the question. He said, "Hey, I'm 63 years old. I have a church of 60. All I know how to do is run programs. Can you help me make disciples?" And, I scrolled through my toolbox as a consultant and a longtime practitioner, and I couldn't help him. I really felt like the tools I had were too complicated. And so I said, "Hey, give me a week and I'll help you. I'll teach you how to make disciples." And I spent a week putting together, really deconstructing all my disciple making models and coming up with this real simplistic approach to disciple making. And trained him the following week, and then started applying it to my own life and saw disciple making results take off, So to me, it was, organizationally, I've always been, I've thought, my heart has been a discipling heart for years, and I've done it. But to the extent that I'm bought in, and to the system I'm bought into now, the simplicity of what's happening and the level of multiplication I'm seeing for the first time. And by the way, hey, I'm 62 years old. Okay. So I did ministry 40 years without some of this more organic approaches to disciple making. And it's just radically transformed my own life and my own living out the mission of Christ.
Yeah. And when you started, I just want to highlight this in your story, fill in a gap there. When you started with your family and built out from there.
Yeah, absolutely.
That picture
behind me is an old picture now. I mean, we're a year more into it. I just can't keep up with it, but I keep it up here to remind me. But yeah. So when we started, I started right here. And if you see the name Amanda at the bottom, who works with me, she's my daughter, and T is for Tammy, my wife. And this is where we began. So the yellow is first generation, the green second, the blue third, and the red are major environments that God has opened up to us, And so, the parable of the sower is what we're living, good soil, 30, 60, 100-fold. Every day is an exciting adventure. But again, it requires a level of simplicity that is costly. You have to, it's really risky. And I think, one of the questions you sent us had related to risk. And I was just thinking about that question, getting ahead a little bit, Matt. But I realize that my greatest risks are ahead of me, because I'm bivocational in the sense that I have a full-time consulting job. But as I get more and more invested in disciple making, I've got to give something up. You know, like, am I going to step out in faith and totally sell out to following Jesus, or am I going to go do the next consulting gig? You know, and you know, my organization may be listening to this, but I want to be real with them as well. You know, that those are the tensions that any of us are going to live with. Just like pastoring, Dan and Trey, you know this so well. Am I going to do what's expected of me, the way it's expected of me, or am I begin to take risks and move outside of it? You know. Now let me say one more thing, and I'll move on. I'll be quiet. You know, I have not given up on the established traditional church at all. Matter of fact, I think it's a great harvest field for disciple making. And I think it's missiologically correct, because if you look at the life of Paul, where did Paul go? Paul always began in these cities that he moved into with the synagogue, because these were people who believed in a God. They were theocratic. You know, they had this theocracy or this theo understanding of God. And they had been dispersed, you know, years and years earlier, and had formed synagogues. You know, so to me, and I read things like in Acts, where a great number of priests became obedient to the faith. You know, so to me, you know, what I hope to see in the short span of things is I want to see pastors converted to an organic approach to disciple makers. Because I think you've got to become a disciple maker to be a disciple maker. And you got to be a disciple to make disciples, what I'm trying to say here. And we can all say we preach sermons and we lead organizations that are disciple making, but that's not what I'm really talking about here, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's huge.
Yeah.
I think it's huge. And kind of what I've come to notice too is, you know, there are people growing in their faith in the established church. There's people that are giving their time, their money. You know, they're growing in their faith. They're praying. They're trying to make impact in the community. And I think for that reason alone, it's a good thing. Also, theologically, it's Jesus' bride. And I don't know about you guys, but if somebody makes fun of my bride, we're not friends. And so, you know, it's Jesus' bride, but I think when we make it the one size fits all, like it's almost like saying everybody has to eat McDonald's. What if I don't want McDonald's? You know, and I think that's where discipleship really changes the picture. Is sometimes you need a different expression. I think especially in Dan's case, I think that's the biggest hindrance to doing Hispanic ministry is if it has to be Sunday morning at that time, he misses probably 2/3 of his congregation because they're working.
Yeah, I agree. The established church, it's beautiful, it's relevant, it's valid, and there are people that are connected and growing in their faith. It's just there's more to it. There's more, you know, and so, you know, like my transformation was, you know, I was big church, grow it, you know, but also reaching into dark places to do it. But then, you know, so my journey into making disciple making the main thing, it's been a long one. And I'm going to be honest, I'm still a work in process. God's still working on me on it. But you know, because I've like Dave, I've always been into making disciples. That's kind of been a thing for me. And then I heard Alan Hirsch speak. This was probably 10, 12 years ago. And he flipped my view of discipleship upside down. He said, you know, normally what we do is we take believers and we start to disciple them. So we make believing the prerequisite to discipleship. And he said, that's not how Jesus did it. He discipled these 12 guys long before they actually got it. I mean, you could say they, you know, make one case that they got it in the upper room when Jesus appeared to them. But I really think they didn't even get it till the second chapter of Acts. That's when they really got it. But Jesus had been discipling them the whole time, and he sent them out and they were doing ministry. And so that started to change my view of discipleship. And then when I hit the ground as a church planter, and I realized that all the stuff that I'd planned wasn't really what was going to connect with the people that are in my area. And even the format, there just wasn't the infrastructure to do it. It started making me think differently. And then I was doing some sessions with Matt. He was coaching me, and a few things kind of came together all at once. One was I read Discipleship by Jim Putman. Great read. Yeah. Read that thing, because what it does is it makes you figure out what your definition of a disciple is. And so you got to start once you've got your definition of a disciple. If you don't know what you're making, if you can't define it, then you're not going to, you can't intentionally make anything that you don't know what it is. Right. And so at that point, then Matt said, so you're planting a church, and whatever the culture is of your church, when you start, that's going to be there for a long time. So make the main thing the main thing. And he said, what do you want the main thing to be? I said, well, I want to make disciples who can make disciples. And then he asked me a simple question, but it was the biggest thing in the world. It changed everything. He said, so how do you do that? And so I started reverse engineering. I was like, I used to be a touring musician, spent 10 years on the road. This was BC, before Christ. And then, and so I was like, so what took a rocker who was disconnected and turned him into a pastor who's planting a church? And, and I love Sunday morning, but Sunday morning was not the main thing that influenced my discipleship. It wasn't a sermon that I heard. It wasn't songs that I sang. It was relationships with other disciples. It was having great mentors. It was being in small groups. It was Bible studies. It was sitting around the fire pit with a beer and a cigar and my Christian buddies, and just talking about life and how Jesus fits, how my life fits into really Jesus's story. Those were the pivotal moments. And so, and then I looked at being part of a growing church that started with the large worship gathering, and then said, hey, we need to get deeper in trying to get people from the large gathering into those relationships that will produce discipleship. It was like pulling teeth. And, and if you get 20% of your people to make that shift, you're doing good. You can pat yourself on the back. And I was like, that's not enough.
You get 20%, Trey, you're writing a book.
Right.
You get 20%, you're writing a book, man.
Yeah.
That's a huge win.
I was like, I want 100%. And so everything shifted, and we just, decided we're going to start with making disciples. And then the church is going to emerge from that.
Okay, you guys have done an amazing job laying a foundation for the part that I'm so excited to share with everybody, which is this. Now that we've said discipleship has shifted your picture of church, now that people have that underpinning and they know kind of what your picture was before, I want each of you to share what your church looks like and what are some of those highlight points, and where are you seeing lives begin to turn and change? Because knowing all your stories, I think people are going to see some similarities, and I think they're going to see some radical differences, but it's all stemming from that same spot, which is being attached to the vine of Jesus and letting him grow the fruit that's supposed to come out of discipleship in the church. So I tell you what, let's start with Dan. Dan, share some of what you're doing with Camino de Fe.
Yeah. So, one of the ways that we reach out to the community is we go to a community, we find the need in the community, and we do everything in our power to provide for that need, right? And so whether during the pandemic, during the shutdown, it was a food pantry for those who didn't have a job, or just talking about path for citizenship here. And so we try to find those ways to help the community. I mean, I think the point for us is we truly care about your whole being. And we want you to have a relationship with Jesus. And at the same time, we want you to succeed here. And so that's how we connect with them. Then we have their phone numbers and their names, and then we follow up with our sermons online. And then one or two families would like to learn more about God and about the faith, and that's how we start small communities, and we start from there. But I think the point to all this is being able to be a disciple, which David said, in order to be a disciple maker, right? And I have mentors, and I continue to seek that, so that someone is helping me be a disciple, so that I can continue to make disciples of others. And I think that's key. It's been a key for me, because we tend to go back to our default, right? No, Sunday morning is ed. And for us, like you mentioned, Sunday morning is not ed. I mean, we do it, but my expectations is not, oh, they're going to come. I mean, we do it because it's part of who we are. We need to worship God. But also we do worship on a Friday. We do worship on a Wednesday. When we're doing discipleship, that's what we're doing, worship, and helping people connect. Because a lot in our community, especially, a lot of people are working 2 jobs. Sunday is the only day where they have to enjoy family, but just rest. And for us to be like, no, you need to come. We can't really do that, because if we truly care for them, for the whole being, then we need for them to rest. And so find another time for them to connect with us.
And I love that, Dan, because if I were to describe your ministry from somebody outside, I would say it's like the feeding of the 5,000, where the disciples that were close to Jesus grew a ton in who he was and what he was capable of. But the entire group was blessed by what happened. And so when we're talking about, Dan started with 10 people in a living room doing discipleship, and now he's got leaders that are growing out of that, but he's literally so embedded the gospel in that community that non-Christians who are in the Hispanic community and non-Christians in the community are all coming to Dan, and Dan and Camino de Fe have actually become a bridge from new people coming in and the existing community, because they just desire to be able to connect, and they need that person that can help connect them. And so the fruit of Dan's discipleship ended up being more disciples being made and some leaders being made, and a whole community being impacted by the miracles God was doing. So I had to brag on you, Dan. I had to share that.
Thank you. And I just want to also add this. So discipleship, right? It takes different forms, because it's about sharing the gospel, but it's also the way people imitate your life. Right. And there's a guy, actually there's more than one. And they start sharing our stories online, and they're starting helping people. And one time I asked, well, what are you doing? Why are you helping people? And they were like, well, I'm just imitating what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And that's huge, that we are in a community, and discipleship is people seeing what you're doing and imitating what we're doing. I just want to add that there.
That's huge. I love that. All right, who's going next?
All right. So very similar but different to what Dan's doing. So I got to Houston in August of 2019, and we all know what happened in March of 2020. But this shift to discipleship for me happened actually 2 weeks before everything locked down. I committed, okay, I'm going to see, I don't know what this looks like, but God, I'm going to make disciples. That's what we're going to do. Had no idea what to call it or anything at this point, but then everything locked down, and so I pushed the pause button on planting. I had my supporting congregation, they needed help. We had other church plants in our network, they needed help, and so I pivoted to kind of fill some needs during that time. But what ended up happening through that was, I really only had a few real relationships at that point. And one of the relationships that I had was a couple named John and Cammie Spain. And I had actually baptized John on Ash Wednesday. So yesterday was his baptismal birthday 2 years ago. And then everything shut down a few weeks later. And I was like, okay, I've got to, I felt a little bit responsible for keeping them connected. So we started doing Zoom meetings on Monday evenings. Every Monday evening we would get on Zoom, and it was for discipleship. I mean, we were very upfront about it. And so it was amazing to see this couple go from newly connected to now they want to be micro church leaders. They're gearing up to be micro church leaders. But that was one aspect of it. So that's the personal discipleship aspect of it. But then there's what's happening in our community, in our neighborhood. So in our neighborhood, we're very culturally diverse. There's 5 different nations represented in the houses that just surround me. And our neighborhood is fairly new, and it was basically designed to keep people isolated, and people just didn't know their neighbors. And so what we started doing, we just started throwing parties. We started throwing parties and inviting our neighbors. We threw up a movie screen in the driveway, pulled out the grill. I'm a home brewer, so I bring out the home brew, and we just started inviting people and telling them, if we're hanging out in the front yard, I want you to hear that, I'll ask them, what's your name? Oh, John. If you see us party in the front yard, I want you to hear, John, you're invited to come over. We want you with us. And so we started having parties. And then during COVID, we met some of the folks from the parties, but during COVID, one Sunday, the church that we were helping out with online only. So I just said to my wife, hey, honey, why don't we just worship together as a family on Sunday? Okay. Right before we were going to worship as a family, ran into my next door neighbor who was packing up his truck, getting ready to go off to rehab. I said, hey, Randy, we're about to worship as a family. You want to join us? Totally not expecting him to say yes, but he said yes. And so it's like, okay, give me 15 minutes. I'm going to go print off the words to the songs and meet us in the backyard. And so we worshiped together. At the end, he said, man, that was the best church experience I've ever had. And after he left, my wife and I were like, yeah, that was pretty cool church experience. It was pretty awesome. And so we decided to invite some of our other neighbors the next week. And they came over. We weren't saying, hey, we're going to launch a church. We were just we knew they were believers and their church was shut down. And so they joined us in the backyard. And at the end, they said, this was nice. Can we do it again? Well, yeah. And so we've been doing that every week since. But we've got 2 dynamics. We got what's happening in the front yard and what's happening in the backyard. And it's that transition that's, so we, in the front yard, at this point now, when we throw a party, we got 50 people that show up, and it's awesome. And our neighborhood is transforming. We call it making our neighborhood more neighborly. And so we've got this couple, she's a self-professed pagan. He's a self-professed atheist. If you ask them what they believe, that's what they say. And at one of our parties, we were inviting one of our newest neighbors to come to church in the backyard. We built a relationship with her over the last few months, and it was time to invite her. And our pagan neighbor, she said, now I'm a pagan in front of everybody. I'm a pagan, so I don't do church. But if you're a church person, you should go to their church. They're awesome. They're not judgmental. They're really laid back. And then her husband said, yeah, I'm an atheist. You should definitely go to their church. And now she comes to our church, the person that the pagan and the atheist invited. And on top of that, they let their daughter come to our church sometimes. And so the thing is, they're being discipled. They just don't know it. And she came up to my wife and I at one of our parties and said, you're changing my view of what a Christian is. And she said, I know these parties are expensive. Next time you have one, tell me, I want to pay for the food. So now the pagan and the atheist are paying for our outreach events too. So, and the thing is, do I want them to be connected to Christ? Absolutely. But I have to trust the Holy Spirit's doing the work in their life, and he's using us and our relationship to do it. Sorry, I've been going on. I can keep going on. I've got stories and stories. But
that's great.
That's huge. But huge.
I figured a story was the best way to really describe what making disciples and starting with discipleship looks like.
Yeah.
That's all. Dave, share your story and your picture of what the church is starting to look like. And then there's one golden thread after that I'm going to tie together for everybody that you might not be able to see, but I want to make it apparent.
Yeah. So when we started, let me start with the definition. First of all, through COVID, God sort of really worked on me, and so I've got this working definition of church. I wanted to get out today if I got out nothing else. But and to me, a church, not the church, but a church is a family of disciples on mission together, advancing Jesus's kingdom by making disciples who make disciples. And you could even say, and planting churches that plant churches if you wanted to. And so, this whole idea of family of disciples, prior to that, I'd written several things, and I talked a lot about church being a community of disciples. But when I got in that situation where there was nothing but me and my family, I realized that, Trey, sort of like with, let's do church as a family, is I realized that the most basic unit of church was a family. All of a sudden I realized there was a reason when Jesus said, where two or three are gathered in my name, I'm there in the midst, And so anyway, for me, we started with our family, not doing church, but making disciples. And the little tool we put together really had no intention. I had no agenda. Matter of fact, I was careful not to have an agenda because I'm an agenda guy. Okay. So I felt like part of my following Jesus was just entering into it as pure-hearted as I possibly could be. And so we wanted to create a anytime, any place, any pace disciple-making tool. And so that's what we did. But when we started using it in our family, God began to really transform our lives. My life was changing. My wife, I don't have time to go into it. Her life was changing. God was taking us to a different level. The best way I can describe it, God was taking us to a different level of kingdom engagement, more so than we'd ever experienced before. And so one of the places I get a lot of community is my CrossFit box. And so we ended up, finally our box opened back up and I went in, and now I've been, discipling my family, and I had this new tool that we had put together, and I met a new friend, and I just asked him if he'd begin reading through the Gospels with me. And he said, yes. And he ended up being just a really supersonic person of peace for us, a connector. He was a coach there in the box, and he caught the vision for multiplication, making disciples who make disciples. And so we do micro groups, or what we call triads, 3. We don't do any larger than 3. We don't add people to our groups. We always multiply them. So if I were meeting with Dan and Trey, and one of them said, "Oh, I want to invite somebody," we'd say, "No, we need to multiply. We go start someone." And we did this little thing where, hey, you invite your one. So if I invited Trey, I'd say, "Hey, Trey, you invite someone." He'd go invite someone. We have 3, And so it doesn't take long to outgrow 3. It doesn't, especially if there's fruit that's happening. And so we begin to multiply pretty rapidly, So out of that, we said, hey, we got to add a coaching structure. So we added a coaching structure, and now out of that, we're adding groups, or micro churches, you might want to call them. And so, but our goal was never to create a church the other part of that, to be honest, going back to my definition, family of disciples on mission together, advancing Jesus' kingdom by making disciples who make disciples. The other thing is that we entered into a phase of church that I wasn't too familiar with. Like, we were so busy being the church, I no longer had a clear line, of where do you stop being church and start doing church,
Mm.
For me, the priority became to be the church.
Yeah.
And, I just finished being church. I just spent an hour and a half with a couple I've been investing in, whose lives were broken not too long ago, for breakfast. Tomorrow, I'm going to be pouring my life into two guys, one who's been through a divorce, another who is about to go through a divorce, pouring my life into them. And then following that, I'm going to be investing my life in what this person of peace I was taught. It's just, we're just all the time church now. Now, that doesn't mean we don't meet, we don't gather, we don't do other things, because we do, because you have to create structure or it all falls apart.
Yeah.
But to me, that's sort of, where we are. We're figuring it out as we go. And what we see is a group that's forming. So we would say, hey, that's a micro church. So we went from micro groups to micro church, which, when you get multiple micro groups going, you've got a church. You just need to pull it together. So it's really easy. I used to go from crowd to core. Now we go from core to crowd and try to avoid the crowd as much as possible. But
I love that.
Grow, and the way we grow is we don't only multiply micro groups, but we multiply micro churches, and then out of that we become a network of micro churches. So that's sort of the progression that we're seeing. And again, we're early on, so you can ask him next week, and it'll be different, a little bit different anyway. Yeah.
Hey, David, I remember when micro church wasn't even on your radar.
I didn't know what it was.
Yeah. You were like, we're doing micro groups. That was the thing. And then, and then we were supposed to meet, and you were like, I'm going to be late for the meeting because our micro groups are saying we've got to be a micro church. It just kind of, so like you made disciples, and then the church emerged, because, I think it's Mike Green that said, if you make a church, you might get disciples, but if you make disciples, you'll always get the church. And that's it, because, if we look at it, nowhere in scripture does Jesus say, go plant a church. No. He says, go make disciples.
Yeah.
And because the church isn't a place, the church isn't a time on Sunday, the church is a people. We're the church. And so how do you make the church? You make disciples.
Well,
and I think that's huge. And two, the other thing is, I think a couple things stuck out, Dave, when you said something. One, that you felt like you were in uncharted territory, because I don't think some of you may not realize, if you can do it in church, Dave's probably seen it. He's planted it. He's consulted with it. He's like he's, when it comes to church, to surprise Dave is a surprise. But that's what happens when you're going so radically contextually, is you're starting to see these new things spring up. And the thing that I would highlight in each and every one of these stories that I think is so amazing, and to Trey's point, it's why that quote from, I think it's Mike Breen too, Trey, is so important, which is, if you plant a church, you might make disciples. If you make disciples, you'll plant a church. Is each one of these guys accidentally planted a church. Like, they did not intend to plant church the way I specifically know, and have had conversations with each of you offline in the past, where you're like, yeah, I accidentally planted. So now we're figuring out what to do next. And I think that's the exciting thing about when you start with that discipleship center, is the thing everybody's trying to do just kind of happens.
Yeah, and Matt, I would say, again, our goal is anytime, any place, any pace disciple making. And so I would say, what I've come to realize is that I had spent I've been engaged in my CrossFit community, this specific one, for 5 years. So I was in it 3 years before we saw any fruit. But what happened was it became a harvest field for us. And when I say us, there are others that are involved, and the church thing, is just something we're trying to figure out what that looks like going forward at this point. But I would say to every church, you're sitting, again, it's back to Paul, you're sitting on a harvest field. In our vision work that we do with Auxano, we ask the question, 5 irreducible questions of leadership. The 5th question is the vision question: where is God taking us? And I'm really encouraging you today that are listening to this and other churches to ask the question, hey, what does a disciple making movement look like among us? If God was to so move in and through us, what would that look like? And then the other thing I would just say real quickly that I think was one of my greatest learnings through this is, again, back to the parable of the sower. There's 4 types of soil, only one where it grows 30, 60, 100-fold. And then Jesus, in between stating that parable and then interpreting that parable, says this: listen to me. Now, I want you to hear this. I'm doing the same thing, right, that Jesus did. Listen to me. And here's what he said. He says, you've got to get this parable to understand all the others. Let that sink in. In other words, he was giving us the key to the kingdom.
Yeah.
He told us he would, right? The gates of hell shall not prevail, and I'm going to give you. Okay, he's given us the key, and the key is a multiplication key. And the other thing that I've come to realize that has radically changed my life, and I would pray that it would radically change everybody's life, is it's taken the pressure off of me, because I've come to realize that everybody's not going to do what I want them to do.
Yeah.
It's the parable of the good soil. If I can just find one, like my buddy Jeff I described a while ago, who's a real person of peace. It just doesn't take many to see great fruit happen. But I think sometimes we as pastors and leaders in the church, we spend all of our time trying to corral people who are just not interested in what we're doing, or they just don't want to take their faith to the next level. And so I just say, so what we do in our disciple making is we go through the Gospels. And I would say, hey, everybody on here, you ought to go through the Gospels. You ought to just take a trip through the Gospels and let Jesus inform the way you approach church planting or leading your church, or re-inform, because that's what he had to do with me.
Well,
and I think
David, something
ahead,
I noticed when you were talking is everything that's up on your board there came out of your CrossFit relationships. Your network of relationships that already existed. And I think that existing churches have a huge untapped resource, and that is the existing relational networks of all the people in their congregation. Because so John and Cammie, the couple that I discipled through COVID and who are about to embark on a micro church adventure of their own, they've got people chomping at the bit because they already have an existing relational network that they've had for many years. They've lived in their neighborhood for 10 years. I just moved here, so I'm having to build a relational network. I came from the outside. So what their expression of micro church, I think, is going to explode way quicker than mine, because I have to build the relational network first, because the vehicle for the gospel is a relationship. It's not, it's not just saying some words. It's you have to build a relationship. And I say you have to earn the right to share the gospel with people. They got to know that you care about them. They got to trust you. And so we've spent the last 2 years here just building trust with people, and we're just now starting to get that trust. And so people already have that trust. And so let's use that, equip them to share the gospel in their existing relational networks.
Yeah.
Well, and I got to jump in here because we're going to go overtime, which is fine. And we're going to go overtime. So if you want to stick on, stick on. But There's one really important question I think needs to be asked, and I think each of you have a really tangible experience with. This is always fun to talk about. It's always fun to dig into, but talk to me about, what have you had to sacrifice in order to do this? Because I was just doing a message on fasting yesterday with my congregation. And I said, the reason we fast is you have to let go of something to be able to hold on to something new. And you guys are talking about new wineskins and doing something new, but I know fundamentally you've had to let go of something or sacrifice something.
Hey, let me jump in.
Yeah.
Jump there, Matt, while I can remember it. But I think the number one thing that I've had to surrender is control. Like, this is really out of control. I can't keep up with it. And so that would be one thing I would say. And I would say another thing is glory. And what I mean by that is you really have to die to yourself to be a disciple maker. You've got to be willing to get in the background. And I think as a pastor, I was always the point. I was always the person people looked to. And I think John the Baptist was right when he says, I must decrease in order for him to increase. So, I mean, to me, the control thing, and a quick example would be my buddy who calls me and says, hey, and he was frustrated. And he said, I just found out we have 5 micro groups happening in the Denmark high school, and I didn't know anything about it. And I'm like, congratulations. But really, it was challenging him because he was not in control. And he, like me, we're both high control people. So we're having to learn how to surrender that. And we both are, we're learning that. But as a pastor, that's hard to do.
Oh, that's huge. So control is one. Dan, Trey, what are some things that you've had to let go, or some challenges you've had to take on in order to do this?
Yeah, I'll go first. Just my default view of church, because my tendency is always go back to my default. Sunday morning, they should come here. Why are not they here? And to understand that what is happening is that it's taking place in their communities, in small groups, and in other places. And it's a constant battle, because I mean, when we have worship, my radar goes up, and counting people, offerings, and all that, and like, it's the relationship and building that, being intentional about it. So yeah, it's just giving up that default view of my own view of what I think the church should be.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's huge. That's huge.
So there are a couple of things. One was that this wasn't the model, so to speak, the people who were supporting me were expecting. They have always done the large launch, been successful at it. And so that was actually a fear that I had to overcome to even get to the point where I was committed to disciple making first and foremost. And thankfully, the people that I work with, that I'm accountable to, who are also accountable to me. And that's the great thing about networking with folks. They've been really awesome and gracious and supporting. And so, because the things that the metrics that you have for this are totally different. You can't measure the things that the church normally measures. And so I was talking to my supervisor, so to speak. And I was like, I want to be held accountable to stuff. I just don't know what to be held accountable to. But the thing that I know is that the Holy Spirit is leading in this direction. And his name is Al Daring, and he's just a phenomenal, amazing person. We're part of the Harvest Partnership, which is a church planting network. But he said, Trey, the thing that I want to hold you accountable to is following the Holy Spirit. I was like, whoa, who gets to do that? That's pretty amazing. So I'm blessed in that, but it was still really hard to get to that point. And I was actually making decisions before being given that freedom to ride the line. And so I was basically serving two masters. And then the other thing for me, it's kind of a personal thing, is that, I come from a worship leading background, creating and developing worship services that can connect with both church people and unchurched people is my wheelhouse. I can do it in my sleep. I can put together phenomenal bands. It's just the gifting that God's given me. And I'm not using that. I had to give that up because that's a totally different thing. And so I'm not working in my wheelhouse. I'm working in God's wheelhouse. I have to rely on the Holy Spirit in this instead of relying on my own strengths and giftings.
Amen.
That's huge.
That's huge. That is huge. Yeah. Maybe you could just go back into rocking and go out on the concert trail and just blast them with the gospel.
Well, I'm looking for some guys that want. I'm getting the itch to play now. Looking for some guys that want to just put together a bar band, and go and connect with disconnected folks.
I've worked recently with the church in outside of Fort Worth, and their worship guy and several of them, they had a bar band, and that's what they're doing. Pretty cool. So I know God's going to let you use that gift. He's just going to use it in a different way.
Yeah. Well, we've done bar church before.
Yeah, that's right.
Absolutely.
So I could talk to you guys forever. I'm going to let you guys know a couple of things. One, if you want to connect with these guys, I know, Amanda, if you can throw that link in there again to connect with Dave, we'll also throw that link into the follow-up resource. But also, we've been talking a lot about micro-discipleship and discipleship, and we've actually done a few webinars on that. So what I'm going to do in the follow-up resource is I'm going to shoot the follow-up resource to you all as a free online course. And it's actually going to have the other webinars that we've done together on those topics. So you can dig into this one, watch the replay, but also pull those other ones up. So the final thing I would say to you is, what would you say to somebody, maybe their existing pastor, maybe they're a church member? What would you say to somebody who's hearing this and they're like, I got to take that step? What encouragement would you give to them, and where would you tell them to start?
Yeah, I have real strong opinions about this, Matt. And what I would say is, get a very simple, I would encourage you to use our approach. We'll be glad to give it to you. Just obedient-based disciple making. And just find someone in your church, start pouring into them, let them, and start small. I think a lot of times what we want to do is we want to just preach a series on discipleship, call everybody to obedience, and then we have 10 people out of 100 that says yes, and we feel like a failure, and we make everybody else feel like a failure. And really 10 people, if I had 10 people, I think Jesus took 12 and transformed the world, So I'm telling you, this is one life here, and this is probably going out to 100, 200 different relationships now. I don't know, maybe more around the world. And what if you had 10 people doing that? I'm the ordinary Christian, I'm the ordinary guy here. I'm traveling on an airplane every week. I'm not in the middle of the church. I'm your lay person. And just imagine, get one or two of these guys going, gals going, and you can see transformation. So I'm really really focus on, hey, start small, slow down in order to speed up kind of mentality.
It's huge, huge.
So just do something.
Yeah.
Learn to follow Jesus by following Jesus.
Yeah.
And you know what? That's how we even promote it, because we're trying to get it out to everybody. It's we want to bring to you a simple disciple making tool that is again, it's simple, it's immediate, and it's bulletproof against any pandemic. You can start having disciple making results tomorrow just by sitting down with someone and helping them process what Jesus is saying to them through the scripture, and then them doing it. You're seeing results already. So man, just go at it.
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback off of what David says. Stop talking about how to do it. Stop researching and coming up with the plan on how to do it, and just start doing it. And as you're doing it, let the plan unfold. Let the process, because in the church, we spend so much time talking about how to do it, theorizing it all and stuff. And it's when we just need to start doing it, the Great Commission isn't, the command isn't go. The command is make disciples, and it's as you're going, as you're just living your life. So just go ahead and start doing it. And if something doesn't work out, learn from it, but to get, I said that, but a theory kind of thing that I think is important is figure out what the definition of a disciple is. If you don't know what it is, you can't make one. And so spend some time. I really recommend Discipleship by Jim Putman as a way to get into that process, but just really figure out what it is, and then be committed to it, and say, okay, a disciple is, and then make that, and so that's what I've got.
That's huge.
Great. So just going with what Trey said, be one. Be a disciple. Right? I mean, just go, whether it's your pastor or someone who knows a little bit more, and learn. Be committed, like Trey said, and start there. You're not gonna be one unless you are one. Right. And oftentimes as pastors or people who are mature in the faith would think, oh no, we don't need that. But I'm constantly seeking mentorship and trying to find other brothers who are, are more mature that I can learn from. And the other thing is, like what David said, start small. It's just a quick story. Oftentimes in our worship, we try different things, and oftentimes it's just my family and I, and it could be discouraging. But I just took the time to, like what Trey did, is just I worship with my family. And I'm telling you, there's so many times when it's a Sunday evening that we were by ourselves and we just worship us. I just did the entire service. And this past Wednesday, yesterday, my daughter has a friend, and she's been a friend for a long time with this girl, and she brought her to church. She invited her. Now, did I tell her to do that? Not directly, but she sees some of the stuff that we're doing. And it starts here, it starts at home, and then it moves on to that. So start small. So be intentional, build relationships, be one, be a disciple, and go from there.
Yeah, and I love that. I think those are a huge piece of advice. And each one of you talked about that disciple. And I even heard a couple times like that definition of a disciple. And some of you guys are throwing yours in your chat. I think when I would say a definition of a disciple is really define it in your own words. But what I found was I tended to overcomplicate it. And then one day I was having a conversation at an exponential learning cohort, And it was just like these light bulbs were going off in my head. I was like, you already have the simple definition. It doesn't need to be more complicated than that. For me, it was, somebody who experiences, connects, and reflects Jesus, and that life of a disciple, I grow when I continue to do that. And people experience Jesus when they see me being a reflection of Jesus. And when I realized, God, I don't need to make it more complicated than that. It was like light bulbs. Yeah, huge. Well, guys, I just want to thank you all for hanging out with us today, for having this conversation. We're going to send out a follow-up that'll have this, other resources you can use. If you want to find out more, you can check out thekairosnetwork.com. You can also check out plantingthegospel.com. Is it .com or .org, Dave?
.com.
.com. Yeah, we're all .com because that's the way we roll. But check that out. And if you'd like to connect with anybody, we're going to throw some follow-up emails and stuff in the chat. Definitely do that. But man, for right now, just thanks for hanging out with us. And please, whatever you do, just go try something, because you never know how that could change everything. So thanks for hanging out with us. I'm going to end the recording now. And then if you have any follow-up questions, you can hit these guys up after we end it all down.
Thank you.